Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Spring 2025 Symposium for the Initiative on Religion, Pluralism, and American Public Life here at Wake Forest University School of Divinity. My name is Corey Walker. I'm Dean of the School of Divinity and the Wake Forest Professor of the Humanities, and I'm delighted that you're joining us for our Spring Symposium. Bob Dylan's "With God on Our Side" appears on his 1964 iconic album, "The Times They Are A-Changing." The song is part of the 1960s folk revival, along with Dylan's increasingly politically salient lyrics at the time. The song would be one that Dylan would later call his finger-pointing songs, one where he would leave his signature acoustical style for a more electronic style. The song combines Dylan's personalist philosophy with his growing anarchist commitments. It was adapted from a 1957 song, "The Patriot Game," by the Irish folk singer Dominic Behan, who memorialized the death of a young Irish Republican Army soldier. "With God on Our Side" questions the ideal of political loyalty based on blind obedience to nationalism and unquestioned religious belief. Dylan's song underscores the pitfalls of religious nationalism and foregrounds his mercurial, complex, and ever-changing relationship with Judaism and Christianity. "With God on Our Side" reminds us that the challenges and changes of identity and political loyalty are never easily negotiated, particularly when authorized and guaranteed by appeals to that which is ultimate. In the wake of Dylan's song, religion remains at the center of American public life. At a time when the very foundation and future of American democracy is intensely contested, religion functions both as a panacea and as a problem. Religion animates our most intense debates and fuels our highest aspirations. Yet the tremendous challenge of the moment requires considered and critical reflection on a number of issues, including how and in what ways scholars and people of faith can and should inform and engage public life. It is an imperative for us to understand that the languages of religion and the languages of politics are not mutually exclusive. Our contemporary moment is one that is not merely a struggle over the good and over the commons, but rather how we understand how religion critically aligns our politics and how our politics are critically aligned by our religion. Wake Forest University School of Divinity's initiative on religion, pluralism, and American public life critically engages this complex intersection by examining the contested discursive material and theological sites where religion is salient and where our political life, our common life, intersect, conflict, and offer us possibilities of new futures. We understand that we must think religion in a complex manner. It is a fundamental part of the human condition. Religion forms and informs the ways we make assumptions about human nature. It informs how we prescribe norms for appropriate social conduct, how we establish our identity, and indeed, even how we maintain boundaries. This inaugural year of this initiative, we have taken up the theme, "Across the Borders of Tradition: Conversations in Jewish and Christian Thought and Theology." And as much as we have examined the intersections of Christian and Jewish thought and theology, we also are interested in probing new directions and ways in which this conversation opens up new opportunities for us to engage pluralism and our democratic futures. This year, the initiative has hosted a number of scholars in the fall and 2 distinguished scholars today, in order for us to extend an invitation to form a type of border thinking that is relationally resonant, reflexively operative, and ethically, epistemically, and empirically attentive. In many ways, this initiative and this year's conversations attempt to retrieve a sense of pluralism articulated by William James in his Oxford lectures published as A Pluralistic Universe, where he writes, "It is curious how little countenance radical pluralism has ever had from philosophers. Whether materialistically or spiritually minded, philosophers have always aimed at cleaning up the litter with which the world apparently is filled. They have substituted economical and orderly conceptions for the first sensible tangle, and whether these were morally elevated or only intellectually neat, they were, at any rate, always aesthetically pure and definite and aimed at ascribing to the world something clean and intellectual in the way of structure. As compared with all these rationalizing pictures, the pluralistic empiricism with which I profess offers but a sorry appearance. It is a turbid, muddled, Gothic sort of an affair, without a sweeping outline and with little pictorial nobility." James's pluralism would be taken up by two of his students who attended his Oxford lectures, the German Jewish scholar Horace Callan and African-American Rhodes scholar Elaine Locke. And while James, Callan, and Locke informs this year's theme, the anchor concepts of the theme, across and conversations, announce an invitation to think together and host the turbid, muddled, Gothic thinking across borders in a conversation between Jewish and Christian thoughts and theologies that move within and along and around traditions that are always already plural. It is an epistemological and experiential coming together in the infinite space of dialogue. Now, a concluding word on the quote which frames this year's program. Paul Tillich's evocative statement, "The boundary is the best place for acquiring knowledge," is the first sentence of his autobiographical statement in On the Boundary, an autobiographical sketch. It is a dominant theme that Tillich employs to narrate his life. For us, it captures the spirit of this year's theme. Taken from his first major theological work, Religious Realization, it not only aptly describes this unique boundary thinker, but also the very boundary conditions of Christianity's and Jewish thinking and theologies across time and space. The trace of this thought will be part of our conversation inasmuch as we tarry within the tension between the sacramental and the prophetic, between the constitutive and the corrective, and between the critical and the creative. While we can take Tillich's statement as a point of departure, our dialogues aspire to give life and fresh expression to a style of thinking that attempts to do justice to thinking, doing, and believing in a radically plural world. I'm delighted to welcome our first lecturer this afternoon, who's a distinguished scholar and, most importantly, a dear friend. Terrence Johnson is the Charles G. Adams Professor of African American Religious Studies and Professor of African and African American Studies at Harvard University. He is also a faculty associate of the Safra Center for Ethics and affiliate faculty in the program in American Studies. He is the author of Blacks and Jews in America, An Invitation to Dialogue, which is the winner of the 2023 Outstanding Book Award from the Association for Ethnic Studies. He's also authored We Testify with Our Lives, How Religion Transformed Radical Thought from Black Power to Black Lives Matter, and Tragic Soul Life, W.E.B. Du Bois and the Moral Crisis Facing American Democracy. He is currently completing another book manuscript entitled Torn Asunder, Race and Religion in the Shadow of Law and Justice, which will be published by Columbia University Press. He is a 2024-2025 Stephen M. Poland Fellow in Constitutional Law and History at the Brennan Center for Justice, co-editor of the Duke University series, Religious Cultures of African and African Diaspora People, and co-editor of the Harvard Theological Review. He is also a member of the Corporation of Haverford College. Along with his scholarly writings, Professor Johnson has written for and appeared on CBS This Morning, Salon, NPR, and the Literary Hub. He is a graduate of Morehouse College and received his Master of Divinity degree from Harvard Divinity School and PhD degree in Religious Studies from Brown University. The title of Professor Johnson's lecture this afternoon, Between Exodus and Exile, Blacks, Jews, and the Crisis of Liberalism. Please join me in welcoming Professor Terrence L. Johnson.
Good afternoon, friends. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm really excited to join my good friend and HDS classmate, Dean Corey Walker. Thank you for extending this incredible invitation to join this community today. Also grateful to be in conversation with Dr. A.G. Levine and my colleagues at Wake Forest, Catherine Shanner, and great to see an old colleague and friend, Dr. Marlon Milner. 62 years ago this year, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel stumbled upon each other in 1963 at the National Conference of Christians and Jews in Chicago. Meeting a year before the Ku Klux Klan kidnapped and murdered civil rights activists James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schroeder in Philadelphia, Mississippi, King and Heschel had long admired each other from afar for their distinct and overlapping theological justifications for condemning racial and economic injustice in America and religious and ethnic oppression in faraway places such as the Soviet Union and South Africa. Cornel West calls them standard bearers of the prophetic tradition. Indeed, standing at the intersection of Egypt and Jerusalem, both men turned to their primary theological training to investigate the nation's long history of anti-Blackness, anti-Semitism, and racial and ethnic violence. Their primary sources came from the Old Testament. From distinct religious heritages, they upended liberal Protestantism's political complacency and silence in a nation torn by religion and race when they introduced a new interpretation of Exodus and Exile. Conference attendees sat in shock, visibly angry by their respective lectures. Rabbi Heschel's lecture was especially noteworthy. To the chagrin of many, he interpreted racial segregation through the lens of the Exodus narrative. In his conference speech titled Religion and Race, Rabbi Heschel argued that, quote, Pharaoh is not ready to capitulate. The Exodus began, but is far from having been completed. In fact, it was easier for the children of Israel to cross the Red Sea than for a Negro to cross certain university campuses. Let us dodge no issues. Let us yield no inch to bigotry. Let us make no compromise with callousness. In his poignant analysis of racial segregation, Rabbi Heschel challenged three leading interpretations of Exodus. First, New England Puritans claimed their sojourn across the Atlantic to this land as their Exodus, where they secured for themselves the bounty from New Jerusalem. Second, the Puritans extended the narrative to justify their unique political and moral piety, what literary theorist Sven Berkovich would eventually frame as a pretext for American exceptionalism, a nation perched on a hill gazing down on Mount Sinai. Third, the Negro sorrow songs, the music Du Bois called the nation's first and singular expression of beauty, embrace Exodus as God's sign of their impending liberation from captivity. The late historian Albert Rabateau punctuated Du Bois's characterization. He argued that, quote, no single symbol captures more clearly the distinctiveness of Afro-American Christianity than the symbol of Exodus. The Middle Passage has brought them to Egypt land, where they suffered bondage under a new Pharaoh. Strikingly similar tone, more than 15 years before Rabbito's groundbreaking book, Slave Religion, The Invisible Institution in Antebellum South, Rabbi Heschel transposed the Exodus account to articulate a normative claim about religion and race in the post-Cold War nation. Integrating racially segregated colleges and universities is far more tedious than crossing the Red Sea. Not only did the good rabbi invite the stranger to join in his community's story of liberation, but he did so by disrupting and decentering Jewish exile to explore the narrative of a people who remained in bondage. Blasphemy, one might shout. Essentialist and naive, others might retort. Emblematic of Jewish self-hatred, some might decry. Rabbi Heschel, and likewise for King in his sermons, questioned and sometimes subverted the central truth claims of their traditions to express a broader point about social justice. Born under vastly different circumstances, Heschel in Warsaw, Poland, and King in Atlanta, Georgia, they nonetheless found a meeting place in the valleys and mountaintops of their respective biographies and group histories. Dr. Susanna Heschel, Rabbi Heschel's beloved daughter, writes that their friendship was established, quote, on the transcendent issue of saving the soul of America. In 1968, on Rabbi Heschel's 60th birthday, King praised Heschel's enduring commitment to civil rights. Quote, all too often the religious community has been a tail light instead of a headlight. But here and there we find those who refuse to remain silent behind the safe security of stained glass windows. And they are forever seeking to make the great ethical insights of our Judeo-Christian heritage relevant in this day and age. I feel that Rabbi Heschel is one of the persons who is relevant at all times, always standing with prophetic insights to guide us through these difficult days. Their idealism and prophetic imaginations were not always embraced. On any given day in their respective 5-year friendship, they faced fierce backlash from their respective communities for so-called brazen appeals to religion that fueled their condemnation of racism, anti-Semitism, and the Vietnam War. Today, many of us cannot imagine a legitimate friendship between a rabbi with Hasidic roots and orientation and a preacher informed by liberation theology and black power, let alone an alliance between black and Jewish communities. In the wake of Hamas's gruesome attack in Israel in 2023 and the subsequent war in Gaza, the relationship between blacks and Jews is on life support. And in this time of what I might call national moral decadence, when personal and collective grievances mask as righteous discontent, elected officials pride themselves on sustaining political gridlock, and synagogues and black churches continue to sit in fear of religiously and racially motivated violence, many of us, and justifiably so at times, are searching for refuge within familiar political religious contexts. We find increasing comfort in communities prefigured by algorithms to avoid being offended, misinterpreted, or verbally maligned. The turbulence of the moment is a prime opportunity to return to our altars of hope, where social prophets like Heschel and King beckon us to remind persecuted peoples to recall the profound transformative import of Exodus and exile. The return to primary source material is not necessarily a move to claim a unique and solitary origin story. Instead, we find an alternative hermeneutical shift in King and Heschel's political and spiritual friendship that is generative both philosophically and politically. They found kinship in their cosmopolitan, dialogical, and provisional interpretation of biblical narratives, as well as in their calls for social justice. Put differently, interpretive disagreement within a rubric of social justice might be the necessary tool from which to exact and extract power from empire and to sustain the trials and tribulations of allyship. What would it mean then to reorient political alliance and political power in the context of Heschel and King, on the grounds that philosophical divergence and interpretive disagreement might be the future of our coexistence? What do their interpretive moves tell us about the ongoing crisis of liberalism? This point, I think, affirms and extends two historical claims raised by two giants in the field of Black and Jewish studies. Cheryl Greenberg argues in Troubling the Waters, Black-Jewish Relations in the American century, that both groups' belief in democracy stems from their strategic uses of liberalism. She writes, quote, "Liberalism protected differences and grounded civil rights arguments. These organizations argued that a liberal democracy which supported participatory citizenry and the dispersion of power was critical to the defense of civic equality." She rightly notes that their collective turn to liberalism, a kind of placeholder for political philosophy aimed at cultivating voter rights, equality under the law, and equal access to economic opportunities, sat in tension with a teetering intellectual investment in communism and rogue capitalism. On the other hand, Eric Sunquist seems to suggest that the asymmetrical relationship between Blacks and Jews, and often contradictory appeals to Exodus and Exile, establish a mutually beneficial and oppositional understanding of the Promised Land. Sunquist makes this argument in his noted book, In Strangers in the Land, Blacks, Jews, Post-Holocaust America, where he acknowledged that this tension did not converge into a fragmentary vision with mutually beneficial purposes. Instead, it created parallel antagonisms and political aspirations in what Sunquist calls the deployment of bipartisan liberalism. Debates on the Holocaust exasperated the tensions. Sunquist writes, quote, "The Holocaust became the benchmark of genocide against which African Americans and African American slavery and its aftermath has been judged. The analogical attraction of the Holocaust that began with Black reactions to the Genocide Convention gained ground through assertions by Black militants in the 1960s that the government was targeting African Americans for extermination. Accusations by the Nation of Islam in the 1980s that Jews themselves bore special responsibility for the Holocaust of slavery and the slave trade, and arguments along the way in favor of Black reparations modeled on those paid to victims of the Nazis," end quote. Here is a juggernaut in Black-Jewish relations: the failure of bipartisan liberalism to account for the non-liberal justifications for violence against Blacks and Jews. As an ethicist interested in ideal theory, alongside a Du Boisian political and moral realism, I want to squeeze into the profound conversations framed by Sunquist and Greenberg to propose the following. On the one hand, thin liberalism has been the collective friend and foe of Blacks and Jews. This conceptual model for imagining liberty and equality assumes political rights and equal economic opportunity would establish an iron veil to protect them from and mitigate religious and racial violence in an ideal liberal society. On the other hand, thick liberalism, by virtue of the convergence of citizenship with whiteness in 19th and 20th century America, created the conditions for commodifying and consuming Blackness, while it embraced Jewish assimilation and exceptionalism on one condition, according to Eric Goldstein in The Price of Whiteness, Jews, Race, and American Identity: that Jews remain the perennial other and outsider. In both instances, Blacks and Jews, biracial Jews, and Black Jews found themselves facing a similar set of consequences: political and social death. In other words, these wandering peoples who were in search of a home attempted to eradicate political and social death with tools ill-equipped to answer the lingering existential questions and political consequences of their non-existence within a white supremacist society. They assumed rights and equality could largely solve their crises, sustain them, and protect their peoplehood. Framing liberalism and its critics. In the 1990s, the late political philosopher Charles Mills raised one of the most illuminating criticisms of liberalism developed within Anglo-American political philosophy. In fact, he pieced together the concerns raised by a previous generation of Black political and moral philosophers, including Frederick Douglass, Andrew Cooper, and W.E. Du Bois, into a coherent and compelling argument. Liberalism, Mills argued, was born, quote, in a world fundamentally shaped for the past 500 years by the realities of European domination and the gradual consolidation of global white supremacy. He characterized this as a racial contract, an outgrowth of moral and political commitments that ossified a racial hierarchy we commonly call the white-black binary, a, quote, divide between persons and subpersons. As Mills described it, the racial contract, quote, explains how society was created or crucially transformed, how the individuals in that society were reconstituted, how the state was established, and how a particular moral code and a certain moral psychology were brought into existence, end quote. Blacks and Jews, I shall argue, signify material fragments of Mills's racial contract, as they reflect the shifting but perennial subpersons during the rise of 20th century Anglo-American political philosophy and remain the target of racial and religious violence in the US. And yet, as noted by Eric Goldstein, while disproportionate numbers of phenotypically white-passing Jews have been the beneficiaries of the economic fruits of racial capitalism, there remain the ironic outsiders to a political and social power established upon racial hierarchies and Christian supremacy. To put it crudely, middle and upper class professional and economic status have not protected Jews from racial and religious violence. To this end, why should we care about blacks and Jews at this perilous moment for some and triumphant occasion for others? How might a conference on religious pluralism provide the epistemic tools to help our various constituencies understand the political, economic, and social consequences of a sitting president and South African billionaire attacking higher education and the federal government with a literal chainsaw as Congress and the Senate sit and watch in silence? This latest political threat to liberalism reflects the convergence of white supremacy, Christian biblical literalism, and economic inequality, all three of which represent long-standing concerns raised by communitarians like Michael Sandel and Charles Taylor, and critical theorists such as Mills, Lewis R. Gordon, and Carrie Day. To be sure, current-day criticisms of liberal democracy are emerging from a multiracial coalition of persons who are nonetheless committed to racial and religious hierarchies. Friends, to borrow from Martin Luther King Jr.'s 1959 Morehouse commencement address, a revolution is taking place in our nation and around the world. Triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic and fueled by the police killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, a collision of calamities punctuated a fledgling revolution teetering between debates on David and Goliath and Sarah and Hagar without any attempts of reconciliation and repair. Justice as an epistemic and political category is vilified as anti-intellectual and ineffective. Why then return to King and Heschel in a moment when blacks and Jews are more divided than ever? Unlike the ongoing catastrophes in parts of Africa and Haiti, or the domestic turmoil over immigration and defunding and criminalization of diversity, equity, and inclusion curricula at state and local levels, the Israel-Palestine catastrophe dominates the consciousness of so-called left-leaning blacks and Jewish political and religious activists. The complexity of the moment is not new, and yet the criminalization of social protest and certain types of free speech within existing forms of sexual racism and bigotry is noteworthy. What are we to do? The political friendship between Heschel and King is neither naive nor a form of escapism. Instead, it is tactical. It anticipates what Fred Moten calls the politics of social death. For Moten, I believe, blacks are not bound ontologically to social death, Orlando Patterson's analytic narration of pre- and post-enslavement in the New World. Instead, social death is a heuristic and political apparatus emerging during the nadir of Enlightenment and colonialism. In an apparent departure from Frank Wilderson, the politics of social death depend upon the political and economic abjection of blackness, a material and social condition, rather than an ontological dilemma or perilous damnation of non-being. Social death, then, might be constant, but is not totalizing. Social death may feel all-consuming when we watch reel after reel on social media of slain bodies in our streets, but it can either destroy what Moten called recently a people or swallow their souls. That is the sacredness of Du Bois's interiority and double consciousness. While I am convinced of Afro-pessimism's diagnosis, King and Heschel can help us imagine in the wake where Christina Sharp, the messy struggle to and with freedom is informed and shaped by the contours of Exodus and Exile, where we are called to reconsider the necessity for individual and collective friendship between blacks and Jews. Unlike any other racial or religious group in the United States, the historic and ongoing violence against our specific communities, while dissimilar at times, nonetheless established many of our leaders a kind of double and triple consciousness, a tragic continuous empathy with those facing violence and bigotry. This ethical orientation burdens many black and Jewish communities with disproportionate responsibility for creating a just society. What I'm struggling to articulate is best stated by Shile Mdimbe's conception of existence. He writes, quote, "Is losing everything or nearly everything better? Letting go of everything or renouncing everything or nearly everything, the condition then under which we may win some serenity in this world, an age of turbulence, a world in which oftentimes what one has does not tally with what one is, and what one earns entertains only a distant relation with what one loses?" End quote. Exodus and exile, that which sits in the wake of blacks and Jews, where strangely enough, both groups might lose themselves and their connection to peoplehood for the sake of becoming universal and accepted as human. Blacks and Jews, a brief history. Let's start with the accomplishments. In the mid-20th century, southern states sought to expand Jim Crow, while northern cities engaged in their own forms of discrimination. Black and Jewish strategists responded by orchestrating a nationwide plan of action. The ensuing, quote, Fight for Freedom campaign of 1953 essentially framed the NAACP's legal strategy for the civil rights movement. The passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was another triumph, eliminating, albeit temporarily, barriers to voting for African Americans. In that same year, the alliance generated its most iconic image, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Rabbi Abraham Heschel with arms linked together in Selma, Alabama, crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Yet the accomplishments and the optics obscured more complex realities. One popular belief about the so-called alliance is that from its inception in 1909, the formation of the NAACP, it was based on a sense of, quote, fellow feeling, rooted in mutual recognition of common oppression. Certainly there were many history buffs in both groups who recognized that their counterparts had endured and continue to endure the very worst that Western white Christendom had to offer. Yet in accordance with Jane Baldwin's dictum that suffering ennobles nobody, we must recognize that political pragmatism, more than empathy, powered their relationship. First and second generation Jewish Americans, according to my colleague Jacques Belenabla, were escaping Eastern Europe's iron fire, look at the black experience as a frightening proof of concept. The concept being that this nation too could display unimaginable cruelty towards a minority. To Jews, black misery was like a crumble zone. It absorbed the impact of white Christian violence while warning of imminent danger. When Jewish leaders advocated for black civil rights, considerations of self-interest were not inconsequential. The late Michael Staub argues that Jewish interest in civil rights activism stemmed from a, quote, kind of Holocaust analogizing that might best be described by the term bystander anxiety, the concern that in failing to work on behalf of African Americans, other Americans, including American Jews, might be behaving no better than most non-Jewish Germans under Nazism, end quote. Likewise, for underfunded but intellectually and tactically spry African American organizations, Jews provided them with financial resources and additional legal resources to combat disenfranchisement, segregation, and anti-blackness in general. This partnership was maintained by elites, a kind of talented tenth of clergy, lawyers, journalists, scholars, artists, and the like, almost all of whom were men. This left the majority of blacks and Jews, male and female, to forge their own relationships. These encounters among the rank and file were tense and filled with allegations of racism and anti-Semitism. We blame it on structural asymmetries. When the Great Migration propelled blacks northward in the early 20th century, they met Ashkenazi Jews in New York, Boston, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Chicago, and elsewhere. In these urban enclaves, the Jewish-black relation was often one of landlord to tenant, grocer to customer, housewife to maid, etc. Such pattern inequality is never likely to foster solidarity, writes my colleague Belenabla. Behind the scenes, however, the elites tried to quell those tensions on the ground, even as they bickered among themselves. There were fissures within the groups as well, most notably between a younger generation of radicals and the old guard civil rights leadership. Black power was the issue at hand. In a letter to the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee's Executive Board on October 11, 1966, Joyce Latner asked the members to critically engage both the rhetorical and political implications of Black power. Quote, "What kind of definition do you think he, Stokely Carmichael, will be able to give Black power to keep it moderate enough and yet radical enough to keep the camps together?" Latner questioned in her brief letter. The question emerges from the ethical dilemma of being the offspring of Du Bois's Negro problem, the ongoing quest among Blacks to develop political philosophies that serve dual purposes, justifying one's humanity while simultaneously fighting for political freedom. In fact, I argue the radical left within SNCC did not seem as interested in radicalism for the sake of domination or the acquisition of absolute power as it was in shedding light on human flourishing and expanding the available political and economic opportunities to a disinherited people. Indeed, Latner exposed a political conundrum rarely examined in the political literature on Black power, the role of humanism and humanistic activism in politics. This ideological shift burst into full view after the 1967 Six-Day War. Now, the Black Power movement equated Israel with, quote, white settler colonialism. This likely tore asunder the so-called Grand Alliance. Stokely Carmichael's call for Black power underscored the divide between Blacks and Jews on the question of capitalism. Carmichael envisioned economics as a tool for social and political power, maintaining a community, and providing means for political independence. In a veiled racial and anti-Semitic slur against Jews and other ethnic entrepreneurs who own businesses in Black communities, Carmichael argued that, quote, exploiters come into the ghetto from outside, bleed it dry, and leave it economically dependent on the larger community. As with the missionaries, these exploiters frequently come as a friend of the Negro, pretending to offer worthwhile goods and services when their basic motivation is personal profit and their basic impact is the maintenance of racism, end quote. Carmichael's criticism of structural racism and economic inequality acknowledged the internal flaws of what we now call racial capitalism, while also assuming and ascribing upon the so-called exploiters a kind of moral exceptionalism, a belief that political friendships or alliances will necessarily undermine and dismantle the spirit of capitalism's Hobbesian intergroup warfare. Where do we go from here? More than 60 years later, Black and Jewish relationships remain on life support. Why should we consider then reviving this historic and contested partnership? I will limit my reflections to why a new alliance might help African Americans in particular. First, the historic alliance is representative of what Cornel West calls the, quote, insurgency model of 20th century Black intellectual history. That is, the Black intellectual as a critical and organic catalyst. The grassroots dimensions of civil rights activism established upon and extended his call for, quote, new and alternative practices for imagining, quote, collective intellectual work and communal resistance to hegemony. Black civil rights activists, from the preacher and politician to students and the seamstress, embody an insurgency model of activism that can be retrieved for reimagining politics during a moment many are calling a revolution. Second, this historic alliance, to borrow Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham's analytic framing of the Black church, was dialogical and not dialectical. While the debates reflected a kind of Habermasian deliberative exchange within existing liberal norms, their debates often reached a political impasse. Why? In part because they had not created a context in which competing texts and/or political ideologies could be acceptable tools for dismantling and challenging normative beliefs. Without a discourse of transformation, so-called deliberative debates remain locked within a terrain of respectability, where power rather than persuasion and critical judgments can determine whose beliefs are translated into political power. Now, I'd like to raise a question I'm not prepared to answer this afternoon. Is liberalism the flesh of moral decadence, what Nietzsche characterized as a deceptive belief in something as good or beneficial for one's survival. To be sure, moral decadence denotes a decline from an imagined heroic past. But when I grapple with this idea in the context of the herd mentality, I wonder if we might consider moral decadence as a kind of reflection, as well as an indictment of the inability and unwillingness of groups and persons to move beyond mimesis and epistemic malaise. I can account for this in two competing ways. On the one hand, moral decadence manifests itself when the political cries of blacks and Jews are met with the force of political grievance, both rhetorically and materially, in the forms of legislation. Nazism, Jim and Jane Crow segregation are examples. On the other hand, moral decadence can show its face in exile, when groups or persons are seeking to understand their political non-existence in civil society without appealing to their conditions that prefigured their forced exodus and exile. This might be called an appeal to universalism. But in the absence of their narrative and narratives of enslavement and the Holocaust, their political outcomes might sit in tension with slavery, enslavedness, Jewishness and the Jew, blackness and the black. Returning to Rabbi Heschel's 1963 speech, I'm convinced that he laid the groundwork needed to imagine political friendship beyond the kind of moral decadence we are witnessing today in battles between so-called progressives and conservatives. For Heschel, political friendship is always grounded in one's primary resources and traditions. And in this case, it was the, quote, Jewish teachings regarding obligation that most beckoned Heschel. According to Heschel, quote, religion is a demand, God is a challenge, end quote, making racism, he stated, the test of our integrity, a magnificent spiritual opportunity for radical change. What is at stake, Heschel argued, is God. Quote, reverence for God is shown in reverence for man. To be arrogant toward man is to be blasphemous toward God. This hermeneutical move, alongside his racial readings of the Exodus, established a type of engagement based on divergence hermeneutics. Now, how do we make sense of Heschel's theological imperative? King's 1959 commencement address at Morehouse College, titled Remaining Awake Through a Great Revolution, gives us a few clues. He writes, quote, we do not have to look very far to see signs of the revolution that is taking place in our world today. There's a revolution in the social and political structure of our world on the question of the equality of man. The great masses of people are determined to end exploitation of their lives and share in their own future and destiny. They are moving toward their goal like a tidal wave, end quote. King viewed the revolution as necessary in the trajectory of human freedom. Today's revolution is also considered necessary by some, most notably among the voting electorate. And yet we are left with the burden of decoding cultural wars entangled in racist and anti-Semitic tropes, as well as policies against trans communities, reproductive rights, and national book bans that threaten both black and Jewish communities. What is political friendship or political solidarity within King's analysis of justice? First, it is rooted in the collective interest in humankind, and dare I add, the planet. According to King, quote, the individual or nation that feels that it can live in isolation has allowed itself to sleep through a revolution. Second, friendship demands that we remain diligent in monitoring civil society, most notably its technological advancements to avoid remaining politically inept and siloed. As King noted in 1959, quote, certainly one of the tragedies of the present era is modern man's blatant failure to bridge the gulf between scientific means and moral ends. Unless the gap is filled, we are in danger now of destroying ourselves by the misuse of our own instruments. More than a half century later, social media platforms have deepened the gap between a largely segregated and polarized society. Lastly, friendship thrives on interdependence. Quote, no nation or individual is independent. We are interdependent. We are caught up in an inescapable network of mutuality. King's interdependence is rooted in Scripture, Ecclesiastes to be exact, where the writer proclaims two are better than one because they have a good reward for their toil. For if they fall, one will lift up her fellow, but woe to her who is alone when she falls and has not another to lift her up. Today, Senators Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff of Georgia illustrate a possible pathway forward. Stacey Abrams laid the groundwork for their successful campaigns by partnering with Black and Jewish women to protect voting rights and ignite a new form of progressive politics in Georgia, a corrective, I might add, to the historic alliance's gender imbalances. Friendship, solidarity, Blacks and Jews, friends born with adversity, intertwined by scripture and struggle, and sustained through mutual interest in justice and freedom. But are we willing to lose ourselves, possibly our traditions, to develop and sustain new friendships? Returning to Ndembe, quote, is losing everything or nearly everything better? Letting go of everything or renouncing everything or nearly everything, the condition then under which we may win some serenity in this world and age of turbulence, a world in which oftentimes what one has does not tally with what one is, and what one earns entertains only a distant relation with what one loses.
Terrence, thank you so much for that thought-provoking lecture and presentation. And you remind us that this iconic relationship between King and Heschel provides us with some rich resources to begin to think or rethink the foundations of democracy. And I'd like to add a little historical note that on October 11th, 1962, from this Waite Chapel, King delivered a lecture to a crowded room, 2,200 folks here, not only at the invitation of the students of Wake Forest College. And King there gave a speech and addressed the students here at Wake Forest, then Wake Forest College, and challenged Wake Forest and the community to begin to build a better democracy. Many of the themes that he stated that evening would also become those themes that he challenged America with on the March on Washington with his I Have a Dream speech. So I want to begin there because you draw on King and Heschel as these icons, as a model, and that their religious languages, religious ideas can inform our democratic politics. How do you see the limits of those ideas in a moment where there's a fundamental disagreement on what constitutes or properly constitutes the United States?
No, Dean Walker, that's a great question. And, I really wanted, and I'm trying to develop this idea of what does it mean to enter into a conversation with sort of similar but overlapping sort of biblical tropes and biblical narratives on a point of divergence, right? This idea that they're both reading Exodus in a very different way, and yet for Heschel, this is idea, well, what does it mean then to read Scripture not simply to justify my tribal interests, but to read Scripture in a way in which I displace my tribal interests and then bring in the so-called stranger as the sort of the center, and then to use that new figure as a way to rethink my own political interest and the group's political interest alongside a religious language. And I think the difference between simply appropriating or cherry picking to justify a political position, right, is that for Heschel and King, it wasn't simply about a political position that guaranteed their tribal interest. For Heschel, it was like, no, I'm actually going to displace the Jewish people and say, it's actually harder for Negroes. What does it mean then when, again, the stranger story is actually disrupting your own primacy? And it's this idea of what do you lose when you invite someone in? Again, can be seen as idealistic, but I think I'd rather start with this idea, what does it mean to have a kind of divergence than to talk about sort of civil discourse? Because I think what we're losing at this moment is this idea that disagreement is kind of built on a kind of fallacy around civil discourse. And I actually want to think about, again, how do we trouble these conversations with a certain kind of difference that then forces us then to challenge our pre-existing norms about the text?
So when you're appealed to this moment of moral decadence and your rejection of that, so recognizing that we're in a moment of moral decadence, but there's still opportunities for us to forge a political friendship. That political friendship does not have to strip the thickness of ourselves
It is how do we begin to forge that language that enables us to sort of welcome or host
Sure.
that which is other. It's interesting that you go back to religion and race, and I want to tarry that a bit because your model of King and Heschel reminds us that 2 weeks before King is assassinated, he's in the Catskills at the Rabbinical Assembly at the invitation of Heschel, and he's speaking to the Rabbinical Assembly. And they're talking about black power. They're talking about anti-Semitism in African Americans. And King is talking about anti-black racism in Jewish communities. In our moment, we can't hear one another. And I know you don't want to develop another ideal theory, but how does that language operate in the everyday so that we can hear, like Heschel and King heard one another and then wanted the world to hear in a moment of deep distortion,
Sure.
deep violence?
No, another great question, and I want to frame it in terms of I see King and Heschel as an ideal that I don't think we can duplicate, right? And I really see it as something both to push and distort. And I also see it, particularly for African Americans, and this is kind of a hard conversation to have, like, quote unquote, in outside circles, but I'm wondering, what can King teach us in terms of how then to address the so-called other, so-called political allies in a way that allows us to not feel as if we're being appropriated, abused, misused for someone else's political gain, but how do we then use alliance as a way to confront power, right, to extract power, and recognize that power does not always translate into a certain kind of moral language or a moral good, and yet power is also necessary for certain kinds of developments, right, in our communities. And I'm wondering, as I think about whether it's, Mariah Stewart's sort of criticism of, black men in particular not working with black women, what does it mean when we feel as if we're constantly isolated and abused and used for quote unquote broader democracy, democratic ends, and we don't see any kind of fruitful kind of payback or dividends from that? And I'm wondering if in part it's because we want something from this liberal tradition that it can't give us. And can King show us another way in terms of, well, we don't necessarily get our dignity from this conversation, but we actually get something else that allows us then to return to our respective communities, traditions, to be the home of human dignity and use power and politics for very different kinds of ends.
As a scholar addressing this fraught and complex subject in a very perilous moment, this is more of a reflective question on you as a scholar. How has it been, how have audiences received these sorts of provocations for thinking together and rethinking the foundations of democracy in this intense project that you're undertaking?
It's been, deeply challenging and frustrating. I'll just be very frank. I have like probably 3 different camps. If I can be completely honest, my black friends are like, "You're crazy, what are you doing?" And I would say some of my Jewish friends who happen to be white are like, for certain over 60, are like, "Yes, we want to think about reviving this." And I can't figure out how to bring the two together because they both want to revive for very different reasons. And then this third element of people who are like, well, I see this moment in some ways punctuated by the very things we were debating back in the 60s, and we still haven't come to terms with them. And both groups are feeling pained by responses to October 7th and ongoing responses to the Israel war in Gaza. And how do you address this when groups are pitting anti-Semitism against anti-blackness and making kind of a false divide? I don't really know how to articulate other than to say it's a moment where I think we have to dive into historical narratives that are deeply troubling if we want to understand why a particular form of Christianity is emerging now as a kind of catalyst for political change. And we can't have that conversation without, I think, going back to why blacks and Jews appear to be ongoing targets, even when they're used for certain political ends.
Well, Terrence, I know I can continue to ask you questions
Well, I'm sure
all
you can.
afternoon.
Challenge.
But I do want to open it up to our colleagues here. If you have a question for Terrence, please let us know, and we can grab a microphone so we can hear you. But if there are any questions, you can raise your hand and we'll grab a mic. And if not, I have one last thing I want to talk to you about. But we do have one.
So here's my question. King and Heschel are both seen now as institutions of their community. This is a time where I think from the Jewish community, we don't necessarily have that kind of institution. We have obviously institutions, but the lay people don't necessarily agree with them. There's certainly a divorce that I see in my community between what our institutions believe and say and how they behave and how the people I interact with in my community feel. So I know that we've already acknowledged that this friendship is very idealized. How can we even conceptualize that kind of relationship again without that kind of relationship between the institution and the people that it is nominally serving?
No, thank you for the question. And also, we live in very different communities. We don't socialize. We go to very different schools. And our children only interact, I think, through music. I think there has to be a real acknowledgement that there are a number of Jews, both black and white Jews, who are in conversation with African Americans who, quote, identify as a kind of progressive left, who are in conversation at this moment. I think, there are different pockets. We see in Atlanta, I'm talking to groups in Baltimore and Cleveland where non-institutions are developing partnerships, whether it's this idea of Rekindle in Cleveland. There are folks in Baltimore saying, well, a group of women from the Jewish Federation were saying, look, we don't necessarily want to imitate what we saw in the 60s, but how can we have partnerships that actually lead to tangible action? So they have developed mentoring programs thinking about housing, which is a huge issue around the country, but also in Baltimore, where they're partnering with developers and African-American entrepreneurs to think through ways of partnership. So I do think they're on-the-ground issues, but again, they're localized, and the question becomes, do we need something that's broader? But I do think there's enough excitement on the ground where if we can kind of block out all the noise, people are actually doing some really fascinating projects on the ground, but they're not always exciting because we prefer the kind of death race of violence to show how we're pitted against each other. And so I think there are groups working, and I talk to them all the time. And the question is, I think, particularly for African Americans, are we willing to, or are we capable, or should we open up again to a relationship, given, I would say, historic concerns on both groups, for sure, but I hear more of a hesitancy among African Americans when I talk to them, if I can generalize in that way.
Just to dovetail on that question, the lack of the transformed institutional landscape that we've experienced in American democracy from the 60s up until this moment. You alluded toward at the end of your talk about the political friendship and possibilities exemplified by Senators Warnock and Ossoff in Georgia. Can you address that a bit more, tease that out for us in relationship to, here's a possibility of new forms of political friendship that are deeply institutional. I mean, they're two senators from the American South.
No, I mean, it's a great example, and I've been trying to think through this because what's interesting is that, again, historically, the big issue has been, well, the relationship has always been asymmetrical, right? Disproportionately, Jewish funders supporting HBCUs, supporting civil rights organizations, African Americans largely thinking through as the brainchild of civil rights activism, but again, a bit asymmetrical. But I think with Ossoff and Warnock, what's interesting is that Stacey Abrams already created this incredible infrastructure, right? They emerge in a moment where there's a reliance not necessarily on funders or on outside thinkers, but on this black woman who's thinking about reimagining voter registration, voter participation, and in some ways really laid the ground for their election. And again, and it wasn't based on institution, but based on this woman and her efforts on the ground. So not necessarily men getting together to figure out how can we access Gentile power, but in fact doing something that's very pragmatic on the ground. And so they rely, again, they might push back on this, but they benefit from Abrams' work that propel them to the Senate, and they both have been incredible fighters for really, again, protecting HBCUs. Ossoff has been consistently fighting for HBCUs funding, thinking about implications of reproductive rights for black women in Georgia, and also, and Warnock on the same with voting rights protections.
Any other questions? Terrence, I want to thank you. Thank you for your provoking lecture. Thank you for providing us with a model to think with, and also providing us with an understanding and orientation to the ways in which religion and the languages of religion can inform a new politics, a politics that welcomes the deep humanity of all persons, and most importantly for offering us your conceptualization of a politics of friendship. And on a personal note, I want to thank you for years of friendship, my friend.
Thank you.
Thank you for that gift, and thank you all for coming this afternoon. We're going to take a break, and we will reconvene at 4 o'clock for our next lecture featuring the distinguished scholar, Amy Jill Levine.